Welcome back to my video. In the last video, we talked about how to set up our basic environment for us to begin our JavaScript programming. In this video, we'll dive into what variables and data types. So if you haven't checked out the last video, I highly recommend you check it out. So let's get started on variables and data types. So let's start by explaining what is a variable. A variable is basically a box in programming. So within that box, you can store some type of data. So let's say you're creating a game, yeah? You could have a variable called score in which you'll be able to score the value of the player's score. Or you could have a variable called name, which you store the name of the player. So you have three ways in which to create a variable in JavaScript. You could use the keyword var, you could use let, and you could use const. So let me start with explaining var. Var is the old way of creating variables. We do not create variables this way anymore in JavaScript. So we'll probably not use that at all in our code. It usually causes errors which have to do with scope, but we'll talk about scope in a later tutorial. So from here onwards, we'll use let and const whenever we want to create a variable. So when you create a variable, like we said for a game, and we give it a name of score, yeah? So the score of the player is what will be stored in that variable. So usually the score in a game is a number. So the number will be the data type. It will be a numeric data type. And if it's a name, it will be a string data type, like the type of data basically is what a data type is. So in JavaScript, we have a number of data types. We have strings, we have booleans, we have numbers, we have undefined, and we have null. So let me just create a couple of variables here to help you better understand what we're doing. So we'll stick to the example of creating a game. So a game has to have a score. So we'll create a variable using const, and we call it score. Then we give this variable a value by giving it an equal sign, and we declare what value we want to give it. So we want to give this score a value of 10, and we end with a semicolon. So this game shall also have a player who has a username. So we create another variable using const. We call this variable name, and we give it a value of our name, or my name rather, which is lobby, like that. And then yes, we could also add a boolean. So let's give the example of we're creating a game like the snake game, where the snake moves around and every time the snake hits the wall, it dies. So let's create a variable called hit. So we create it using const, and we'll call that variable hit. So the snake, when the snake is moving around in that game, if it hits the wall, it's game over, you failed. Or if it hits its own tail, it's game over and you failed. So it's either true or false. So you begin this game with a false. And then we could also create a variable which we shall call x, which has a null value, and we'll create our last variable, give it a name of y, and this shall be undefined. So to create an undefined variable, you can either give it a value of undefined, or just don't give it a value at all. It's basically saying this variable rather, has not yet been defined. So let me start by first explaining. Oh, just a second here. We cannot create an undefined variable using const, so we'll use let. I will explain the difference between let and const in a short while. So just bear with me. Let's save that. And if we wanted to see what values were in our different variables, we could just use our console log like we did down here. Just delete that and change that to score. Let's save. And then we look in our Chrome here, we can see the value of our variable up here in score. We can come back and change it to name. Save that. And we see this changes to the value of our name. So yes, our first example here is a number which is stored within a value called score. If you wanted to tell what type of data a certain variable is holding, you can type of, then give the name of our variable, which is score. Let's save that, and we can tell here number is the type of data our score is holding. Let's say we created another variable up here and we called it life, and we gave it a value of 2.5. Let's save that, and we check the type of here of life. Life is like a double, it's a decimal number, but in JavaScript it has a type of number. And here we have our name, which we can check real quick, and we see a name is of type string. So if you've noticed something here, when we are storing a variable which has a type of number, we do not we just give it an equal sign. Basically, we just say the variable name is equal to our value. So we are assigning our value. We're assigning this value to this variable and this value to this variable, just like that. But when it came to the string, we had to put it within quotes so that it knows that what we are getting here is not a number, but it's actually a string. It's a list of letters. So if we replace this with a number 1, 2, 3, 4, and we save, we can see it does not read this as does not read 1, 2, 3, 4 as a number, simply because it's within quotes. You could use single quotes or double quotes. I personally prefer using single quotes. So up next here is our variable, which is a boolean called hit. So let's just type it in there. Hit is a boolean. We can see what our value of hit is by just calling hit in our console. And we can see hit is false. So basically, a boolean is a true or false statement. It's used in like a majority of programming. Sometimes, yeah, I gave the example of a game where you're moving with our snake game, and whenever it hits the wall, it should do something. A boolean is what is the best data type to use for such an instance. You could also have it like, let's say you have an e-commerce site. Like if somebody has purchased goods of a certain amount, then allow them to get a discount. So that's just basically another example of how you could use a boolean. Next is a now variable. So let's just go x. So here we're basically saying we have created a variable, but it has a now value, like it has nothing inside it. So that's what a now value is. And lastly, we could also just try type of, so that you can just see that it's pretty much the same. Okay, so yes, when you the type of variable that has a null value is basically an object. We'll talk more about objects in later videos. So our last variable is y. So with y we have an undefined variable. So what it's basically saying is this particular variable does not have a value at this moment. It doesn't have a value. So let's say you are going to assign a value later onwards. You use you create an undefined variable. Let's say you cannot create you don't have a default value for that particular variable. So you use an undefined. So let's just get back here and look at let's look at how to at the difference first of all between let and const. So const is a keyword used when you're creating a variable that does not change in value. Like it's whatever value you create it with, it will go on with it for the rest of the way. So let's give an example of score here. We have score, which had a value of 10. And let's say the player is playing really well, and we can dynamically change variable values by equating them. So let's say we wanted to change our score. Say score is equal to score plus 12. So let's say the player got an extra score of 12. Let's save that. And we get an error here. Why? Because we used our const. We cannot reassign to a const variable. So in order to have a variable which we're able to reassign value to, we give it a let. So once we save that, we can see our error is gone here, and we have our value. We have our value here of 22, which is basically what you get when you get yes, 10 plus 12, 22. So we could try changing it some more here by repeating this score plus 2. And we see here our value changes to 24. So what happens here is this variable here holding our value of score takes the value of 10. It begins with the value of 10 as its default value. So once it comes here, it sees that the current score is 10, and it adds that to 12 and stores it back into this variable called score. So whenever I want to add just a statement to remind ourselves of what we've done here, we could put 2 backslashes, and we could type in whatever. This is called a comment. It's not read by JavaScript, so it's a really good way to keep track of what you're doing in code. It's very easy for you to lose track of what you're doing. So we'll call that, at this point we can see that our score changes from 10 to 22. After this operation is performed, our score in here changes to 22. So after this next operation, in this score variable, this one comes from up here, which is 22, and it adds 2 and stores it into the score variable. And then when we log that variable here, that's the 24. That's the 24 value we are seeing right there. So that's how you could dynamically change your variables, or you could just, with let variables, you could just declare a new variable, let's say 300. And we save that. And once we run, our new value for score is 300, score which was declared up there. So yes, so just remember, whenever you're creating a variable that requires to change, you give it you use the let keyword to create. So stuff like life will probably have to change throughout our game. Stuff like name might not have to change, and boolean will probably have to change it may or may not have to change, depends on what you're creating in this particular project. And that's why we created our let keyword, our y variable rather, using the let keyword, because you cannot change its value. You cannot change its value if it was a const. So you can't declare a const without giving it a value. That will throw you an error. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope to catch you in the next one.